Welcome, everyone. Today's Armchair History Tour of Sparkill is brought to you by the Tappan Library. So it makes sense that we should start on the road from Tappan to Sparkill.
Hi. Today we're taking an armchair walking tour of Sparkill. We're coming down the road from Tappan, called Washington Street. This was first laid out in 1854. At that time there was no Sparkill. They weren't trying to go to Sparkill, they were trying to go to Piermont. We'll see very shortly, just behind me, there was another railroad built about 5 years later that came from Jersey City. And from then on, Sparkill changed a lot. Where we're looking right now, really there was no development, but quite soon thereafter, Sparkill started to take off.
We are on the 1859 railroad path looking towards the Sparkill Depot. The tracks were removed in the 1980s. We will tour the essentially the small business district of Sparkill. We'll walk north along Main Street from Depot Square up to Route 340, then back down Main Street to about where we started out. The station at Blanche's Crossing was replaced by a new larger depot in 1871. The new location became known as Sparkill, possibly named after the creek, but just as likely after the name of a new hotel, which we will see later in our tour. The view you see here is taken from the other side of the railroad tracks looking north, with another view taken recently. By the 1870s, the line was further enhanced with an extension to Nyack. At the time, there were probably up to 22 trains per day. In the early 20th century, I've heard reports that there were maybe 35 to 40 trains a day. By the 1950s, with the coming of the Parkway and the Tappan Zee Bridge, only 6 trains per day operated out of Sparkill, and passenger service was ended in 1965. After a fire, the station was demolished in 1972. The view you see here is looking south from the site of the post office, and John Shields is shown in 1960, who was the station master at the time. Notice that he has what looks like a working telegraph on his desk. And the station is shown probably in the 1960s here. In those days, of course, the mail was delivered by railroad, so it was natural to have a post office near the railroad station. You'll notice that the building is built in the style of the depot, so it was probably built by the railroad itself. This is a good opportunity to read a little bit from a newspaper of the era, which were always decidedly optimistic. The Rockland County Journal in 1872 says, "Postmaster Spencer is in a flourishing condition and has mounted a flagstaff from which floats the starry banner. Altogether, Sparkill, since it renounced its allegiance to Piermont, and when its park commissioners display a little more taste and energy, will assuredly become proud of itself." And we'll find out about what some of those park changes were later on in the tour. So in 1872, there probably was a lot of optimism about Sparkill, but you can see from this picture, which was probably taken shortly thereafter, there wasn't a lot of building there, and there was a lot of open space. You can see the post office in the center, and to the right behind the trees is the train depot. This view on the site of the post office, of course, is from a much later era, but it's such a great picture. I just wanted to share it with you. If you went to high school in the 1950s, you probably recognize quite a few people here. Today's Divine Bar was located in the white building with the awning in the top picture. For a number of years, it served as offices. There was a butcher shop there early on. At one point, this building and the one next to it served as a distribution center for milk. Remember that there were quite a few dairy farms in Rockland County, and they shipped the milk via the railroad to go to New York City. The A&P Grocery was started sometime in the 1920s. Notice that actually there are two A&P Grocery stores here. The one on the right in the post office building with the awning was the first establishment, and then it expanded into the building we now know as Divine Bar. Later on, when A&P moved out to much larger supermarket-style stores, Carl Gallucci bought the building and operated Gallucci's for perhaps the next 40 years or more in the same building. Many of you will remember that. It's a subject that's too big to go into on this tour, but I hope to do more on that later, and I'm looking for any information any of you might have on Gallucci's. The post office building, for some reason known as the Delco building, was built around 1921 and first housed the eastern section of the Orangetown courts. The post office itself was first installed in 1924. Notice from this picture that this is quite a busy place. There's actually a traffic signal on that white stanchion. So this is a very busy corner in Rockland County. Later on, of course, in this same building, there was grocery, there were soda fountains, various ones, barbers, beauty shops. In 1935, the Orangetown Police Department was established here. The police department had existed since the early 1930s, but didn't really have a permanent office or home. There is a small kiosk in Pearl River which was served as kind of an auxiliary office. So there's photos from the time, this one was taken in 1938, showing the cars lined up outside the Pearl River one, but they're the same three cars. So I have a feeling that this was the extent of the Orangetown police fleet. Just to the right of the post office is a vacant lot. It's not much to look at now, but it was the site of just one of several soda fountains and candy shops in Sparkill. Maureen's hair studio was once Doria's Italian-American market. Another time it would probably be best to hear about that market and the experience there from Joe himself. But perhaps this is a good time to talk about the Sparkill that Joe has told me about. This may come as a surprise to some people looking at Sparkill today, but Joe always refers to Sparkill as a hub. Why? Because people basically could get whatever they needed there, and there was a lot of commercial interaction, social interaction, plus the government interaction, because it was a government and local town center. Plus, of course, there was transportation to New York, to Nyack. So what were some of those stores that were in Sparkill? This directory is from quite a bit earlier in 1927, but it didn't change much in the maybe 10 or 20 years after that. There was a bank, there were several groceries, a meat market, a pharmacy, a hotel, several garages, hardware store. There was a barber, a beauty salon, a dentist, who was also the banker. We've traveled up Main Street almost to Route 340, where we can see today's Floral Expressions shop. It was built in 1863 by the New Jersey and Northern Railroad to replace or at least to expand the small Blanch's station across the street. By 1876, it was a freight station, and later it was used to store coal and to store grain. Like the vacant lot to our left, where McIndoe's coal yard was, it was damaged by fire in the 1960s and 70s. Basically, this whole area had a lot of fire damage at that point. By the 1980s, the attitude about these historic buildings had started to change. Phyllis Anglis, I hope I'm saying that right, and her family rebuilt this building as the Little Freight Station, which was envisioned as a cafe and restaurant. You can see here in the interior picture when it was completed. Today, it's the Arbor Hill Nursery and the Floral Expressions Florist Shop. Now we're taking a little side trip off of our tour map just to show you something that you might want to expand upon in the future. Remember we said that in 1870 the railroad had been extended to Nyack. This is the beginning of really a tour with signs all the way to South Nyack that you can travel on and see several historic sites. This particular sign was made by Rich Esnard of the Piermont Historical Society. The house in the background was originally Blanch's station, and this whole area is really where Upper Piermont started. One of the reasons we're not focusing too much on Upper Piermont in this tour is because a lot of the buildings aren't there anymore, at least on the part of the route that we're going on. But it's a good time to maybe point out a couple of them. If we go back across the street from our last stop, the site where the condos are now was Kip's store. Just down the street towards Piermont was Boss's Meat Market. And further down Main Street, towards Sparkill itself, was the Sparkill Hotel, which we'll see next. The Sparkill Hotel was located just next door to the current condo development. It was built sometime after 1859, undoubtedly to serve the new rail customers that were coming in. Sparkill was indeed a tourist destination. This was like a trip to the country for a lot of people in denser urban areas. The hotel actually sponsored local picnics and field trips to a small mountain down the street, which we'll see later, known as Sparkill Grove. The hotel remained here until about 1910 as a hotel. It became the Elks Lodge in 1938. Remember that this was in the era of segregation, so this was the Black Elks Lodge. It had a bunch of other functions, but slowly declined. Like so many other buildings in Sparkill in the 1960s and 70s, it was destroyed by fire. I should also mention that there were many hotels in Sparkill. I think I've counted 6 or 7, obviously not all at the same time. But it makes sense because this was a railroad terminus and where people came and needed a place to stay. Also prevalent in the area were quite a few livery stables. You came, you spent the night, and then you got a carriage and horses to take you to your final destination. Oswald Bauer started the Bauer Insurance Agency and in 1909 built the new office that you see to the left of this postcard, the yellowish building. This was a state-of-the-art building with central heat, of course, but also had an air conditioning system. Pretty simple concept. It had great big bins of ice that had an electric fan that blew air around the building. Oswald Bauer was so important to what we know as today's Sparkill that I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about him and his accomplishments. Bauer wasn't the only businessman in Sparkill, but he certainly was one of the most important. Besides founding the insurance agency, he was one of the most prominent lawyers in the area. He also developed real estate as the president of the Sparkill Development Corporation. He was a founding director of the First National Bank of Sparkill. He organized the Orangetown Savings and Loan, which had an office in his building. And he was president of the Sparkill Publishing Company. So as a result, he was a tireless promoter of Sparkill as a great place to live and have a business. He built the Delco building, the post office that we saw earlier in the tour, and he published the Sparkill Herald, which was a weekly paper printed in Sparkill. The photo here is a street sign in the Woodcrest section. Notice the names, of course, Bauer and Austin. Austin was the first president of the Sparkill Bank and also was a real estate developer. As if business interests weren't enough, Oswald Bauer was also very accomplished and influential in government. He was an Orangetown Justice of the Peace. He served as Piermont Village Councilor. Amongst other jobs in Rockland County, he was the transfer tax attorney for the county. He was an Orangetown board member. He was a member of the Tappan Zee High School Board of Education. And at the time of his death, he was a New York State Deputy Attorney General. With this in mind, you can imagine that he was quite influential. An example of this would be the fact that in the Delco building, the first occupant was the courtroom for the town of Orangetown, where, of course, he was the Justice of the Peace. These government jobs didn't happen by accident. Oswald Bauer was a staunch progressive Republican, very active in politics. He was head of the Rockland County Republican Committee. Bauer was also the founder of the Union Republican Club in Orangetown, of course, which was in Sparkill. At the time, Orangetown was controlled by the rather conservative Democrats. Bauer was certainly the prime force in gaining control for the more progressive, business-oriented Republicans. He was certainly responsible for establishing Sparkill as the political center both in Orangetown and in Rockland County. Besides all this, Oswald Bauer was very active in local civic societies. He was president of the Rockland County Horticultural and Agricultural Society. He was president of the Rockland County Fair Association. He had an expertise, at least an amateur expertise, in Native American history and archaeology, and he was a member of just about every social club and charity in the county, as well as scientific societies. It's hard to know whether this was just to serve his business interests best, but I like to think that it was for more altruistic reasons. Establishing the Sparkill Herald was really a brilliant ploy by Bauer. It served both his business interests and his political interests. The Sparkill Herald was labeled very clearly a Republican newspaper. This is a copy of the first edition in 1914, and you can see how it really promotes Sparkill. The headline reads here, "Many new enterprises fully believe in the future prosperity of Sparkill." And in the top right headline a few years later, it says, "A dollar spent at home stays at home, boosts Sparkill." The paper was printed every Friday on a small building on Edward Street, which is shown here. You can just see the sign identifying it as the publishing company. Later, the building became a dry cleaner, and today it serves as storage. And just one last word on Oswald Bauer. I'm amazed at the breadth of his accomplishments and specifically how it was vertically integrated. You have a real estate business. You have an insurance business at the time, insurance agencies basically offered mortgages to buyers. Every insurance company dislikes the idea of fire, so he promotes the fire department. He has a bank which loans to businesses, and he promotes it all with a local newspaper. Not to mention all of his other political and social influences, which must have been enormous. While at this corner at the Bauer-Crowley Insurance Company, we can glance down Union Street to what is now the Union Arts Center, and which was originally built as the original John Paulding Fire Department. It's got too long a history for us to go to in detail right now, but what we can say is that in around 1902, the first firehouse building existed. It was probably a barn that was taken over by the fire department, and you can see that in the top right corner. In 1914, with the advent of larger motorized pumpers, the current building was built. The fire department moved to a new, larger firehouse to accommodate more equipment and larger trucks. And so in 1969 onward, the building was used for several commercial interests, including the Firehouse Craftsman. It is fortunate that we now live in a time where we respect historical buildings a little more than perhaps in the 1960s or 70s. In 2012, the Union's Art Center was established in the firehouse after a really excellent renovation. One thing you might like to see, which you haven't seen before, is right over here. We look at the fire center from where we just saw it. Now we're going to take a different view of it. We're walking along Main Street. We're going to just go by the bank here for a second. And I'm wondering if you see anything now that you might have seen in a previous picture. And if we haven't already talked about it already, the building right behind these trees, above the red car, is the printing shop for the Sparkill Herald. The building on the corner was built in 1872, right after the station was built, undoubtedly taking advantage of the new traffic and commerce there. It was a dry goods store for many, many years. Since then, it has been many other things, several different grocery type stores. More recently, a liquor store, a video store, and on the bottom floor, the dry cleaner some years ago. With any luck at all, the coffee shop that's being built right now will be established soon. I should say, too, that just to the right of this, and maybe more visible in some of the other pictures, was a very large tree, which you can just see the edge of. That tree was actually two trees, but at least one of them stood from before the turn of the century, 1900s, to just a few years ago when it was cut down. I can't leave this corner without sharing just a couple of other pictures with you that show a couple of parades on this corner. It looks like to me like it could be in the 1940s, maybe early 50s, but it certainly was a place of civic pride. Even though the Depot Square had been developed since the 1870s, one of the reasons that the newspaper was so adamant about having the Parks Commission clean things up so to speak, was the fact that there was a very large mountain on the other side of Main Street. This was known as Sugarloaf, and it didn't get removed until 1887. Here we see that they actually built a railroad spur to it and were hauling away the mountain in railroad cars, likely for fill and other large projects. I've heard that it was used to add to the Piermont Pier. And this was at one time the site of the Sugarloaf Grove. I may have referred to it as Sparkill Grove before. So this was kind of like when it was forested, it was kind of like the woods in the middle of town. The bank was built in 1914, as we've said before. Here we can see what looks like the final days of construction. Note the horse and carriage in front. To the left are those trees we were talking about when we were talking about the Maybe building on the left. And I did misspeak before. Actually, Albert Austin was the first vice president, not the first president of the Sparkill Bank, but here's a list of the officers and people responsible for the bank at the time. And of course, the bank is no longer a bank. In 2018, Chase closed it.
As an update, in 2022, the bank building has been sold, and for now, it is perhaps a temporary resting place for some public artwork. Housing in the form of apartments of some sort are proposed here, and it's currently part of a discussion on exactly how big that housing will be. This particular lot was formerly used for a residence, probably very similar to the two here. Interestingly, in 1873, before the mountain was removed, a hotel, a working man's hotel, it was called, was proposed for approximately 150 residents, of which we would basically call that affordable housing these days. So this site has had many uses and many proposals.
I'm going to go quickly through our last three houses here that I want to talk about. The current Latino grocery has been the site of many stores over the past, and it was a hardware store. There was a pharmacy here at one point. There's been beauty shops. Interestingly, a long time ago in the 1910s, I believe there was a silent movie theater here, or perhaps just in back of the store. Of course, there's always been restaurants and bars in Sparkill. A long time ago, this building was Van Sciver's. For many years, people will be able to remember Grasso's restaurant, which is pictured here. Bilbo's followed that. The Depot was there. Woody's. And right now, but maybe not for too much longer, it's the Roost, which will relocate to the Union Arts Center. The Venture Center was built as the Orangetown Republican Club in 1921. We've discussed Oswald Bauer's influence on that. He died in 1925, so it's not surprising that the whole structure of the political system in Sparkill must have collapsed. And the Masonic Lodge bought it around 1926 and established the Wawayanda branch there. And it still remains the meeting place for the Wawayanda Lodge today. What many people remember about the original building is it was built with a bowling alley in it, and that was inherited by the Masonic Lodge. Thanks for watching, and thanks to these very helpful people and organizations who have really been outstanding.